As a nation, we have to ask, when in God's name are we going to stand up to the gun lobby? Why are we willing to live with this carnage? Why do we keep letting this happen?
It's a lot easier to moralize about guns and to shriek about those you disagree with politically. But it's never been about guns.
President Biden and Senator Ted Cruz in a debate over gun violence that has become all too familiar. One Republican who has changed his position on guns is Congressman Adam Kinzinger of Illinois. He joins us now. Congressman Kinzinger, let me just ask you straight up. We heard from Senator Murphy that he thinks that something different may be happening this time, that he has had far more encouraging conversations with Republicans now than even after Newtown. What's your sense? I mean, you're obviously willing to deal on this, but do you think that something will get done?
It does seem that way. I mean, it's first off, I want to commend Chris for one specific thing. I've known him since he served in the House. It is easy in this business to start throwing out things that Republicans aren't going to do and just make it a campaign issue for November. I think he is really, and it doesn't mean it's not going to continue to be a campaign issue, but he is really focusing on what can I actually do at this moment. He gets a lot of credit for that. That's a hard thing. It's a hard thing to do. So I do think we're on the track to maybe getting something. It's not, look, I mean, the reality is I actually think that raising, if we can't get it done, Chris is right not to focus on it now. But I think that raising the age of gun purchase to 21 is a no-brainer. If you look at the Parkland shooting, you look at Buffalo, you look at this shooting, these are people under the age of 21. We know that the human brain develops and matures a lot between the age of 18 and 21. We just raised, without really so much as a blink, the age of purchasing cigarettes federally to 21. I think we need to get there eventually, but I commend Chris on focusing what is possible now. That's important.
I mean, the issue of raising the age, I mean, it is remarkable to look back at all of these shootings and see how many of them are done by individuals, men, young men, 18 to 21. I mean, even Newtown. Now, Newtown, the shooter was 20. His mother actually got him the gun, but many of them are bought legally as 18, 19, or 20-year-olds. But let me ask you about your journey on this, because you were once an A rating from the NRA. You owned an AR-15. Do you still own an AR-15?
I do. Yep.
So help me understand, how did you go from being somebody that was kind of, right in line with the gun lobby on this to somebody who thinks it's time to change these laws?
Look, it's a journey of, getting sick of seeing the mass shootings. Being a strong, look, I'm a strong defender of the Second Amendment. And one of the things I believe that for some reason is a very rare thing is that as a person that appreciates and believes in the Second Amendment, we have to be the ones putting forward reasonable solutions to gun violence. The reaction of my colleagues of the NRA to say, hey, if you want to come and take my gun, so I'm going to walk around, I'm going to go into the Michigan State Capitol with my AR because I can. By the way, can I make a point that open carry, especially with ARs, is one of the more insane things. Maybe out west it works fine. I'm not going to go after it there. But to walk into the state capitol of Michigan with a gun because it makes you feel tough, these are the kinds of things that Second Amendment supporters are doing no favors to defend that Second Amendment the next generation. So for me, I woke up the morning after the Vegas shooting. I had shot a bump stock before. I heard the audio from that shooting. I knew that was a bump stock. And I called for banning bump stocks, which, by the way, was ultimately done. And because of that, the NRA basically said Kinzinger's a rhino or whatever their language was. And I realized, especially then, the only thing the NRA cares about is raising money on your back. They don't really give a lot of money to people. They can get people upset. And they're competing with another group called Gun Owners of America. You think the NRA is crazy? Look at the Gun Owners of America. These are the ones that believe there should be zero restrictions on owning guns. And now NRA has to compete with this group for crazy because that's where they get their money from. The NRA has become, it's gone from defending rights of gun owners, it has become a grifting scam. And all you have to do is look at the last few years of the grifting scam of the NRA to know that that's true.
Yeah, the Gun Owners of America, I remember covering them after the Oklahoma City bombing. They're outright in support of militia movement in the country. But the NRA itself is, has had huge issues with its budget, internal scandals, is not the force it once was, but the issue seems to still have a hold on Republicans. I mean, as much as ever.
Well,
no?
I think, yeah, I think the right to keep and bear arms is important to Republicans. It is to me, too. But for some reason, we've got locked in this position of what are things where we can make a difference. You were mentioning earlier Florida, raising the age of buying guns to 21, the red flag laws. This is Florida, right? This is Rick Scott. This is, Ron DeSantis' state. There was no blowback. Like, let's do that kind of stuff now. Because, look, yes, it's a mental health issue. Somebody has to make a decision to pull a trigger. But can an 18-year-old buy an assault rifle the day of his birthday with hundreds of rounds of ammunition, then buy a second one, make it clear he wants to shoot up an elementary school, and still kill 20-some people with 150 cops standing around? Obviously, yes. So what are the things we can do to stop and mitigate that? This is, Jonathan, you know as well as I do, I talk to people overseas all the time, in my job. This is embarrassing. They look at the United States and say, what's going on? Like, we can have this rich tradition of kind of individualism and gun rights. I'm a big, staunch advocate of concealed carry if you're trained and you know what you're doing. But this kind of Wild West, I'm going to carry a gun around because it looks cool, come and take the gun out of my cold, dead hands kind of attitude. First off, you're not really doing anything to defend your rights with the next generation. Secondly, you're playing tough camp out there while real people and innocent people are dying. So
just before you go, the AR-15, which, as you said, you own an AR-15. Las Vegas, it was an AR-15. The Pulse nightclub, Sandy Hook, Uvalde, so many of these are with that weapon. What do you say to Chris Murphy, who says that the AR-15 should be banned? Straight up banned. Why do you still own one?
I say that I'd love to get in a conversation with him about it in a good way, because I'll tell you where I've come on this. I think we need to have this real discussion, and I don't mean that as politicians say so they can kick to the next question. I think if there's a way to maybe, when it comes to ARs, is there a special license you need to own one? Are there ways that we can ensure that those that own them are the ones, look, again, we all have to admit and know 99.9% of AR owners aren't walking in and having mass shootings. Is there a way to differentiate and make a distinction there? Okay. I'm definitely ready to engage in that conversation, and maybe that ultimately includes not selling them anymore. That's fine, because to me, again, I'm focused on saving life now. At the same time, what's the first thing we can do that I think will mitigate this problem? Let's raise the age to 21. And I think look at the AR discussion as kind of the short and near and far, and also far-term target. Right now, this is insane, and there's things we can do to stop it.
Congressman Kinzinger, and let me also say, I know you're an Iraq War veteran, member of the Air National Guard. Memorial Day weekend, thank you for joining us on this Memorial Day weekend. Really appreciate it. Thank you for your service.
You bet. Thank you.
Joining us now for more on the investigation is ABC News Chief Justice Correspondent Pierre Thomas, an ABC News contributor and former Department of Homeland Security Counterterrorism Chief John Cohen. So, John, you led the DHS effort to about how law enforcement should respond to these active shooter situations after Newtown a decade ago. Help us understand now, how did this go so wrong?
I mean, John, it was a failure. I've been in law enforcement almost 40 years. I am proud of my profession. I respect the men and women who are out there each day trying to make our communities safe. But at the end of the day, we had 21 people die. We had 19 children die. We had people potentially die while law enforcement was on scene. We'll learn more in the days ahead about whether they were properly equipped and whether they were properly trained, whether the incident command system worked as it should, whether the incident commander made the right decisions, whether there were communication issues or information sharing issues. But at the end of the day, it doesn't change the outcome. When you put on that badge, you make a commitment to safeguard the community and protect those who cannot protect themselves. And on that day, law enforcement failed.
I mean, there were shots coming from inside that classroom. You know, a couple of the officers were grazed by bullets. Mm-hmm. But what you're saying is the requirement of the job is essentially to put yourself in harm's way, to break into that classroom and to do it immediately.
It is accepted practice in law enforcement that when responding to an active shooter situation, you enter the location, you locate the shooter, you engage the shooter, you neutralize the threat, you provide care to those who are injured. These incidents generally last less than 10 minutes. Most of the fatalities occur in the first several minutes. You have to get inside that location. You have to stop that shooter.
I mean, one thing that's so horrifying about this is the 911 calls. 4 of them came from a single student. And some of those were told that you could hear the gunfire. The 911 operator could hear the gunfire. But Pierre, let's take a step further back. Mm-hmm. The missed signals. There were clear missed signals regarding this shooter, danger signs that at least some of his friends saw.
There was every indication that this was a troubled young man, increasingly full of rage. And that's the only way to describe it, full of rage. There are examples and sources telling us that he was streaming videos of him abusing animals. Classmates are telling us that he threatened to kill one of them. Classmates are telling us that he stalked classmates, following them to school, knowing what they would wear to school, telling them what they were wearing to school, even though he was not often in school. Creepy is only the word that you could describe to what we've been told. And we have some information that came out on Friday that is literally stunning. There's a series of private Instagram messages to a group of about 4 people in which they clearly are discussing the notion that he's going to become a school shooter. They're discussing it. At one point, one of the people on the chat asked him, are you going to go shoot up a school? And he says, no, but basically you'll see. Now we know what happened.
And I mean, what's also haunting here is, I'm just thinking the 2 of you were on the set of this program just after the Buffalo shooting. We saw the same thing. There were clear missed signals, even abuse of animals. Some of the very same things you're talking about this shooter we saw with the 18-year-old in Buffalo.
Well, that situation, the missed signs, I would describe as a neon, flashing red, Las Vegas kind of missing signal. Here's what happened there. He was asked to write a school paper prior to his graduation his senior year. In the school paper, he responds, murder-suicide, murder-suicide. That prompts the school officials to contact state police. They order a mental health evaluation. He's in a mental health hospital for 20 hours. He lies to them. He says he was joking. And he writes about it later in a private, diary that, yeah, maybe I was crying out for help, but I just lied to them and they bought it.
So John, what do we do? How do we get these, clearly in both these cases, you had people who knew these kids, these people, these 18-year-olds who knew they were troubled, who were worried they were going to do something wrong. How does that not go up the? How do officials not know about this? What needs to be done so that those red flags can be taken into account?
So that's the key question. What Pierre described, the behaviors exhibited by the Buffalo shooter and the Texas shooter, they're not uncommon. This is what we see in almost every single active shooter situation, whether it's ideologically motivated or motivated by some personal grievance. We actually know what to do. And we know the systemic changes that need to take place. Law enforcement organizations need to be able to do threat assessment investigations. They need to work with mental health professionals and others in the community to develop threat management strategies. We have to be able to recognize the warning signs, whether they're on the internet or in our community. And we need to come together as a community.
And to make it impossible for them to buy these guns. I mean, in both cases, exactly. These 18-year-olds were able to go in and buy AR-15 style rifles. So, Pierre, we're almost out of time. But, you and I covered Columbine together at CNN. We've been dealing with these active shooter mass casualty events for a long time. But is there something different now? Has it actually gotten worse?
It has. in general, gun violence has surged since 2019. We saw a 30% increase of more than almost 5,000 more gun deaths, non-suicides from 2019 to 2020. So it's pandemic related, it's tied to the pandemic. But also we're just seeing more active shooter scenarios. In 2013, there were only 17 active shooter scenarios. Last year, there were 60, a nearly fourfold increase.
Dramatic increase, and of course, mass shooting incidents just represent a tiny fraction of overall gun deaths, about 1% or less.
We're talking thousands and thousands every year.
Joining us now is Chris Murphy, the Democratic senator from Connecticut, who has made combating gun violence his mission in Congress. Senator Murphy, thank you for joining us. I want to go back. You were on this program just 2 days after the Sandy Hook massacre. It was just a couple of weeks before you were first sworn in as a U.S. senator. And you were asked at that point, this was 10 years ago, you were asked if Sandy Hook and that horrific tragedy we saw in Newtown was going to represent a turning point, a tipping point, if something was finally going to be done about gun violence. This was your response.
The time for sort of saying that we can't talk about the policy implications of tragedies like this is over. And for us here in Connecticut, well, we're going to grieve and make sure the families have everything they need. We're going to be on the floor of the Senate very soon talking about where we go from here.
10 years later, what has been accomplished?
It's inconceivable to me that we have not passed significant federal legislation trying to address the tragedy of gun violence in this nation, especially because since Sandy Hook, we've seen even worse slaughter in Las Vegas, in Orlando. As has been mentioned, the pace of everyday gun violence has dramatically escalated over the past 2 years. Now, states have passed tighter laws. There have been referendums passed. There are plenty of local efforts that have been successful in tightening up our gun laws, but we need federal legislation, and my hope is that this time is different. I get it. Every single time after one of these mass shootings, there's talks in Washington and they never succeed. But there are more Republicans interested in talking about finding a path forward this time than I have ever seen since Sandy Hook. And well, in the end, I may end up being heartbroken. I am at the table in a more significant way right now with Republicans and Democrats than ever before. Certainly many more Republicans willing to talk right now than were willing to talk after Sandy Hook.
And Senator McConnell, the Republican leader, has tasked John Cornyn, one of his top lieutenants, to take part in those negotiations. Can you bring us inside the room or inside? I guess you guys are having Zoom conversations now that the Senate's in recess. What is going on? What are you hearing from Cornyn and from the other Republicans?
We have continued to work throughout the weekend. I was in touch with Senator Cornyn, Senator Toomey, other Republicans and Democrats yesterday. These are serious negotiations, and we are going to continue to meet through early next week to try to find some common ground. Now, listen, I've been clear. I'm not going to let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Of course, I would love to ban assault weapons. I think that's the probably most impactful way to stop these mass shootings. I would love universal background checks. That's the best way to try to curb the level of violence that happens in my city of Hartford and other cities like it across the country. But what we're talking about is not insignificant. Inside this room, we're talking about red flag laws. We're talking about strengthening and expanding the background check system, if not universal background checks. We're talking about safe storage. And yes, we're also talking about mental health resources and more security dollars for schools, a package that really, in the end, could have a significant downward pressure on gun violence in this country and break the logjam. Maybe that's the most important thing we could do, is just show that progress is possible and that the sky doesn't fall for Republicans if they support some of these common sense measures. We've got a short time frame, Jonathan. We've got to get this ready for Congress when Congress reconvenes in about a week, but I think we can do it.
But let me ask you, in this case, I mean, the issues that we hear the most about are, expanding background checks, red flag laws. Well, this person who bought this shooter here did not have a criminal record. It's hard to see a background check would have stopped him. In terms of red flag laws, he had no diagnosed mental illness. School security, this school system had just doubled its security budget. Let me ask you about one thing that I don't hear a lot about, raising the age. I know you're in favor of this, but is it part of the discussion? Right now, you can buy an AR-15 at 18. You can't buy a handgun until you're 21. So, I mean,
Yeah, I think
is this now part of the discussion?
Right now, we're having, I think, a discussion inside this room about the profile of the current mass shooter, which, as you mentioned, does tend to be young men in between the ages of 18 and 21. That is a profile that does not allow you to buy a handgun, but does allow you to buy an assault rifle. And so there are discussions happening in these rooms about how we recognize this profile and maybe make it a little bit harder for those individuals to quickly get their hands on weapons. I don't yet know exactly what's possible, whether the votes are there to raise the age, but we're having a discussion about what we do about that specific profile, and it's an encouraging conversation.
So you mentioned that some states have acted. One of those states is Florida. After Parkland, Florida passed a law, passed a bill, signed into law by the governor in 2018. Let's look at what it did. It raised the minimum age, as we just discussed, for long guns from 18 to 21. It imposed a 3-day waiting period. It banned bump stocks. It improved background checks. Now, that law, passed after Parkland, was passed by a Republican legislator in a very Republican state and signed into law by a Republican governor named Rick Scott, who is now, of course, one of your colleagues in the Senate. Couldn't that be a model? I mean, if Rick Scott could sign that into law in Florida and support that in Florida, why couldn't that pass in the United States Senate?
The Florida law is a good law, and it's a signal of what's possible, right? It married together changes to Florida's gun laws with some significant investments in mental health and school security. And I, had a long conversation with Senator Scott last week, and had him tell me the story of how they were able to pass that legislation and get Republicans to support it. It also proved that Republicans could take on the gun lobby because the NRA opposed that measure and still get reelected, which has been the case I've been making to Republicans for a decade. So that kind of legislation certainly is a model. Significant, not everything that anti-gun violence advocates would want. And while I don't think we will mirror the Florida law, it certainly is the kind of thing that would make a big difference and would make a lot of families and kids in this country feel more secure and more safe if it passed at a national level.
And very quickly, we're almost out of time. I mean, you have led the discussion on the gun issue, which is obviously a critical one here. What are the other things that you think need to be done, aside from, having gun safety measures, limits on gun purchases, red flag, all that we've just discussed? What are the other issues that need to be addressed to deal with this problem?
Well, I mean, remember, this is a problem that happens every day in our cities. And so we have got to invest in our cities. When you talk to the victims of urban gun violence, they want gun laws changed, but they actually want services for their kids so that there's not a sense of hopelessness that drives many kids into very at-risk and dangerous behaviors. So the president's domestic agenda includes significant money, $5 billion, for urban anti-gun violence initiatives, violence interruption programs. And I think we've got to remember that gun laws is a big part of the solution, but we also have to have, in these poorer neighborhoods, services wrapped around kids and families that need them.
All right, Senator Murphy, it sounds like at least there are some encouraging signs that this time could be different based on your discussion with Republicans. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.